Hey everyone, welcome to this video in the Finding Your First Bug series. Today we're going to be talking about reading JSON and XML, and we're talking about this because a lot of people find that one of the difficulties they have with API hacking is actually reading JSON, and they don't feel very confident with reading it, or XML, because it looks weird, and I get it. I completely 100% get it. So today what we're going to be talking about is specifically how to read it, how to understand it, and how to kind of make a decision whether or not something's information disclosure or not. It is a good first bug, information disclosure. It's not one I talk about a lot, but because there's not really much to talk about. So I hope this video will provide all of the knowledge you need to know on information disclosure. And once again, I'm very happy to announce that this video is sponsored by Integrity. Now, they've sponsored a few of my videos in the past, and if you don't know who they are, they're a bug bounty platform like HackerOne or BugCrowd. They're smaller though and focused on European customers. They are huge supporters of the bug bounty community, sponsoring not just my content, but other creators as well. They have been such big supporters of this channel, especially as I grow, and I'm so happy I get to work with them. I know a lot of people have already signed up. Some people have even found their first bugs, and you've tagged me on Twitter, and I love that. Please do continue. Tag me on Twitter when you find your first bug. Tag me when you get a bounty. I love hearing about it. People have also participated in some of the cross-site scripting challenges they run, and I'm so happy for everybody who's getting involved and really finding that's a community they want to be a part of. A sponsorship has really helped me invest more in the channel, so some of the things I've used a sponsorship for is improving the audio. I've also bought some lights so I can do some face cam stuff. So I'm promoting them because I think they do something really, really great. And I really hope you give them a lot of love from our community. So my link is on screen. It's go.integrity.com/Katie. It's in the video description. It's in the on the screen. Go.integrity.com/Katie. Let's get on with the video. So let's talk about JSON and XML. Why do you need to be able to read it? Being able to read it is really important. It looks really intimidating, but all they're doing is encoding data, like raw data from a database usually. And what do we find in data? We find information disclosure in data. There are other bugs as well, but we're going to be specifically focusing on how to read it and then how to use that to find information disclosures. So I know they're intimidating, but stick with me. I'm hoping that this video will kind of calm the nerves and actually get us started. So where do you actually find JSON and XML? You usually find it in APIs, and that's because it's a good machine readable format without being like language or platform dependent. So data kind of moves between different services, between like a server and a mobile app, for example. You can also find it in like any kind of data encoding. It's super common in APIs. Now XML is a little bit different. It encodes it in a slightly different way, and is definitely becoming out of kind of touch with what people like developers are doing at the moment, but it's still used in quite a lot of legacy applications. So we'll talk about XML as well. And this is what it looks like. So let me get up the little pen here. Okay, so on this side we have JSON, and you can identify JSON because of these kind of swirly brackets here. So each one of these is a key, which is this part, and then a value, which is this part. So we have the key glossary, then we have this, which denotes kind of the difference between the key and the value, and then the value here is an object. Now, one thing that's kind of important to note in JSON is that you can also have arrays, which are denoted by the kind of square brackets. You can have objects. So here we can see that we have a glossary object, which contains title, which contains a gloss div object, which contains a gloss list object, which contains a gloss entry object. So actually quite a lot of the way JSON works is this kind of like nested objects. And then this is the same data in XML. Now you can tell this is XML because it's got these kind of crocodile brackets rather than the curly brackets. So this is JSON and this is XML, and that's how you get the little icon on the video thumbnail. So we have the same thing here. So this denotes what we might think of as an object here, and then it's like HTML, right? So it's closed, glossary must be closed by a /glossary, and we can see it more in title here. And that kind of forms our like XML. And then we can have stuff nested. So inside gloss div, we have a title, then we have gloss list, then we have gloss entry, etc, etc. So let's kind of talk about this in a little bit more detail. So XML, it tends to be more common in older applications. There's definitely a push at the moment to go from XML to JSON. It's definitely really common with like the Windows Microsoft way of doing things. Because that's just how a lot of the code is written in their kind of libraries, and it looks a lot like HTML with like custom tags, and it kind of works the same way. You can spot XML if you see the triangle brackets, little crocodiles. It's still useful to understand because there are XML specific vulnerabilities. So here's what we've got. We've got menu as our item here, and we've got menu at the bottom here. So all of this is in an object called menu. Whoops. So that's all menu. We then have in here items. So item, and then we have an attribute called open. And then we have an ID called open. And we have a value in here. So JSON can only represent things as a key value pair. Equals KV. But XML, because it looks like HTML, can represent things in tags. Oh my god, it's hard to write with a trackpad. There we go. So some of the other things of note here is that we can have, like HTML, a tag which just ends with nothing in it as well. So it's definitely more common in Windows land, and if you're familiar with the vulnerability XXE, which stands for XML entity injections, this is when you'd find it in XML. Now, the second one is JSON. Now, same stuff on this slide as well. It's literally just the JSON version of the previous XML. New applications, very, very common in RESTful APIs. It stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It used to be used when JavaScript printed stuff to the console. Now it's widely used in other languages. It's pretty much the default way of getting data now, encoding data. Sometimes it does encode other information. So for example, if an API is using GraphQL, it will also encode other things about, like, not just the query results, but also that it's telling you it's GraphQL. It's identified with swirly brackets, so these things. Okay, it's object oriented. Each element is an object or an array which contains objects. Now this is a bit confusing, but I'll explain it in more detail. If we look here, we have items. Items is an object. If you're familiar with programming, you can consider that like a pointer, while this is the value within the pointer. So we have items, which is an array, and then each one of these has elements as well. So this here, from here to here, is another object that has an ID of zoom in, a label of zoom in. You can also have null objects as well. So here we have null, and here we have the same original view, label, original view. So a little bit different, but for the most part consistent. You will note that just because label appears in this object, it doesn't need to be in this object here. ID quality doesn't need to have a label. And JSON is pretty flexible with how it works, as long as you have key value pairs or null. So you always need menu, and then you always need to tell it what it is, whether or not that's an object with the swirly brackets, whether that's an array with square brackets, or whether it's a string or other value, like this. If you're in an array, you also need to have a comma at the end of each element. And that's it. That is all you need to know about JSON. a lot of it, and a lot of becoming comfortable with it, is like practice and just really getting used to, okay, this is how this works, I feel confident with this. Okay, so how does this relate to information disclosure? So the important thing about information disclosure is that you need to make the call. Like, you need to look at this and be able to say, yes, data is being exposed there, or no, data is not being exposed there. And it's one of the most common vulnerabilities on HackerOne. It's the third most common vulnerability. But you need to be able to understand the data. Notably, because when you are reporting information disclosure, you really need to understand kind of two things. One is the application, like the actual information disclosure, how you accessed it, the API, whatever, and then you need to know the business case for it. Because you need to make that case to the triager that actually this shouldn't be public at all. So let's take a look at how you can actually do this in practice. Here's some example JSON. If you can tell me where this JSON is from, if you watch a lot of my videos and you recognize this setup, post it below and I will contact the winner for a prize. So here's some example JSON. We have here an array. So we know it's an array because it starts with a square bracket. And we have some objects. So we know they're objects because they start with swirly brackets. And we can kind of see that there's quite a lot of elements in here. Oh, whoops. Terrible. And we can kind of read this and kind of guess what it might be. We can say, oh, there's like IDs in there, there's some names, there's an email address, and there's a bunch of stuff that we don't necessarily understand, like email verified at, created at, updated at. We have a role ID, which might be useful, but it's pretty unreadable. So how do we handle JSON? Step number one is to pretty print JSON. So you can Google this, Google pretty print JSON, JSON beautifier. Burp has it by default now, and you can find them anywhere. It's really important to pretty print JSON because it helps structure it. And then the next step is to ask yourself what you're looking at. You want to always keep in mind that business logic. What is the JSON powering? How does that relate to like the actual goals of your target? And then your third one is, what can I read, and should I be able to read it? So here's the same JSON pretty printed. Again, array, object, and then a bunch of key values. So we've got an ID of 9, we've got the name of test, the email of test@test.com, email verified at, created at, which seem to be dates, and then role ID. Now, how does this relate to the kind of application? Well, we know it's encoding user information, right? This definitely looks like some kind of user system. And that's really important because we can ask ourselves, should people's names and emails, for example, be available to the public? And actually the answer to that is probably yes, because that's not really personal information in the way we might think about it. It might display them, for example. A lot of bounty companies may not consider email PPI either. Because they've got permission to hold it. So they may not consider that and therefore may reject the bounty on that case. Again, we have a role ID. Now, should a role ID be public? Well, that is when we start to say, okay, a role ID might suggest, admin, it might suggest guest, it might suggest moderator, that kind of thing. So the question we're then asked is, should we know if somebody's admin or moderator, a guest? And it's going to really depend on the application. Are moderators supposed to be secret? Is it like, if you use the example of a game, you might want the moderator's status to be secret unless they're actually performing their job. Or if it's a forum, maybe you always have moderator displayed, so it doesn't really matter. Now, this is what you have to consider when you're looking for information disclosure. and how you're going to hack it. So what can we read from, if we go back to this one here, we pretty printed it, yep. We're told ourselves what we're looking at. We know we're looking at some kind of user data. What is the JSON powering? Likely some kind of API endpoint that produces this JSON for like a mobile application. And then thirdly is, what can I read and should I be able to read it? Now we know we can read their name, their email, their ID, some information about when their account was created, and their role ID. Should we be able to see it? Well, we can make a case against name and email perhaps. We can make a case for role ID. The dates, probably not, although maybe that can tell you a little bit about how old an account is, though that's likely not pertinent information. So that's kind of how we might handle it. Let's have a look at some XML then. This is the same data in XML form. Now, this looks a little bit different because of the way that JSON kind of handles arrays when you start a something with an array. So you start with object, then you have an array, then you end the array, and then you end the object. So you always have to start JSON with an object. So here we start with root, which is the same as starting it with just an empty curly brace before starting the actual API results, which appear here. So again, this is kind of, we're kind of looking at the same information here. We can see email / email, so same kind of idea as we were looking at with the JSON, exactly the same data. And here we have null equals true on these, which is the only real difference. But otherwise, it's kind of exactly the same. And how do we handle it? Exactly the same. If you have an API endpoint that's returning XML and you're looking for information disclosures, you do exactly the same as you would with JSON. So first stuff is you format the XML by pretty printing it. You can do it in Burp or by Googling one. Ask yourself what you're looking at. Keep in mind that business logic. We've always got to be thinking about that business logic. What is it powering? What kind of application are we dealing with? That will then inform whether or not something ends up being information disclosure. So if we're dealing with a forum and a username, that's no big deal. If we're dealing with a health application, maybe, I don't know, a pharmacy which leaks user information, maybe it also leaks what drugs they're on. That's when we start to say, oh, okay, this is actually powering something that's quite bad. Like we can't, this disclosure is really bad. So finally we say, what can we read and should I be able to read it? And the process is the same. So here's our pretty XML. Now XML usually starts with this, although it doesn't have to. Notably, this can be omitted. And we have root. So this is what I said before, that in JSON we have to start like this with our object that doesn't really have anything in it, that just has an array. And then each one of these is an element, and inside we have the same deal here. So we have the ID, the name, the role ID, and the email up here. So same data, just in a slightly different format. Notably, we have the true there, and we're thinking the same thing. You know, well, this is the same API endpoint. We're thinking, okay, is name encoding anything? Is role ID? You know, we're going through that and going, okay, yes, no, yes, no. Okay. So let's talk about finding information disclosures. How do you even make the call with API endpoints that something's an information disclosure? Like, how did this person who submitted this $2,000 bug to Twitter decide that private list members was an information disclosure? And it just comes with practice. There's no cheat code. There's no like tool I can give you that tells you whether or not something's information disclosure or not. You have to practice by looking at JSON and making that call. But other things to note here is that there are several kind of more obvious ones. View a storyboard of a private video here. Being able to view a private video when it's not public via, say, an API, that it might be information disclosure. Some of these are kind of more configuration files, but yeah. So let's talk about some tips for information disclosure. The first thing to note is local laws. Understanding what could get a company in a lot of hot water will help you make the call. In the UK, we have GDPR, which I'm sure everyone's sick of hearing about. In the US, there's something called HIPAA, which protects health data in particular. And there's also more legislation coming into California that will protect people in California. So making sure you know what the kind of data protection legislation is like can really help you make that call, because you can easily make the case, oh, GDPR says that somebody's sexuality, someone's religion is a special case of protected data. You are not protecting that data because I can just find it. It's being able to make those calls and using the word GDPR in your HackerOne report. And then we have internal application data. So what an application does and how it does it. Now, when I say this, I'm really thinking about things like source code, API endpoints. If you found an API endpoint that tells you a list of API endpoints, that could be considered information disclosure, especially if maybe you can find one API endpoint that will actually do like a bunch of different things, and that will return every API endpoint, even if it's not necessarily related or that you should see it. So then you have information that gives you an advantage. Now, similar to business logic, it's kind of knowing what the stock price will be tomorrow. It's not just knowing the data and not having access to the data because of data protection legislation. It's using that data to get an advantage and really be able to make kind of like trades on that data. Very common in games is being able to predict the next price of something and be able to know when it's time to buy high or buy low. Okay, so finally, I said this before, is the best way to make those calls is to practice asking yourself whether or not you should be seeing that data. So let's practice. I'm going to show you some JSON examples, and I'll put some XML ones in the description for you to have a look at. And what we want to kind of do here is just discuss this and say, okay, is this a information disclosure or not? So let's talk about the application. This application is for students to learn at home remotely, and it focuses on people aged 13 to 18. It lets them see what classes they have, what assignments they have, what homework has been set, and see their grades. And here is the result from one of the API calls. So here we have class, which seems to have an array here, and in here we have some stuff about the class name, the subject is English, and then we have some information about the students. Now, is this considered information disclosure? Well, maybe, because you can see the grades here of other students. You can see here that Jack Hargreaves got a C in English. Now, although this isn't the most readable like form, it's not necessarily structured in the correct way, you can still read this. I mean, here we've got Riley with a grade of a U. Now in the UK, a U is so bad we couldn't even grade it. So actually, you can have a look at this and even start to populate a lot of information. So Jack Hargreaves here has got a C in English, but Jack Hargreaves is also taking maths. We can see here, and he's got a B in maths. And he's also taking science. He's got a C in science, so you can see that there. So actually, we're not just finding out about like one information disclosure of like seeing one grade. We can actually build up this whole picture of his performance in maths, science, and English. So getting a C, B, and C. Now, this would be maybe not particularly impactful if it wasn't an online learning platform. You can think about what you could do as an attacker with people's grades. You could, for example, tell other students, know how the people are performing. However, if this is public already, say kids already know what grade other people have gotten because it's published publicly, that's a big difference. Now, this is when I say you have to be able to make the call. What is the wider context that surrounds this? Are students allowed to see their grades? Can you find a way that allows them to see it? Because it's not just about this single API endpoint, it's also about lots of other things. Can you see it normally? Should it be public? the thing about information disclosure as a general bug is that making a call can be quite difficult. Now, if I was looking at this, I would probably report this as information disclosure. I don't think you should be able to see other people's grades, because it just doesn't seem right to me. There seems like there's so much level of what you could do to abuse that. You can assume things about people. You know, did Riley get a U here because he's just bad at science, or did he get a U because actually his parents are going through a divorce and he's got mental health issues, right? So there's quite a lot you can kind of do as an attacker, although it's not necessarily what you kind of think of. So let's look at the second one here. The second one is an online store and allows independent stores to sell items online easily and cheaply. Businesses can list any item and it will appear in their shop, and it handles everything from payments to printing shipping labels. All the business has to do is stick it on a box and send it to the post office. So kind of like Shopify. So here we go, we have another API result. So we have shops here. So okay, this API returns a list of shops, and we have each object seems to have a shop name with a manager, which this shop doesn't have a manager, a location, and a list of then items that they sell. So the items go from here to here. Oh no, that's honey. Here, there is. So this is all the first one. And like I said, by using a pretty printer, we can make this look a lot nicer. And they have something about the items that they sell. Now, this is not something that would be considered information disclosure, right? Because all we have is the location, which presumably someone could Google Herbie's Hoodie Hutch and see what, like, oh, they're located at this coordinate, right? Maybe it comes with a street address if you Google it. And what do they sell? Well, they sell, you know, a plain jumper. The only extra information we have is their quantities of what they have in their store. Now, just because they have 6 quantities of jacket with hood in a variant medium, that's not really telling us something we wouldn't be able to see on the website. That's not something that's breaking something like GDPR. It's just not necessarily a bug. And again, in the second one here, we have Bernie's B8 Boutique without a manager, with another location here, which is quite close to the other one, actually. And yeah, so what is this really saying? But so you can Google anyway. They have a lot of honeycomb, they have a lot of wild honey, and they have a lot of beeswax in large, medium, and small. It's not something where we're seeing, like, we can't use this to get an advantage, really. I guess maybe if we ran a competing shop, we might be able to see what's selling well. And that could be an argument that you make, though seeing the sales figures would be way more of an information disclosure. So it's tough to make these calls. If I saw this, I wouldn't call that information disclosure, unless it was hidden in some way. Maybe quantity is like, you know, those sites where it's like, oh, buy now, there's only a limited amount left, and they don't tell you how limited it is. That might be something where you say, oh yeah, quantity might be a bit of disclosing a bit too much information. So other bugs, if you see a bunch of JSON and XML, don't just think information disclosure. JSON in particular is usually a sign of an API. XML is also a sign of an API, definitely something that's a little bit older though. So if you find an API, check for the usual suspects, IDORs, filtering. I've got an entire video on the top 10 bugs in APIs that you can have a look at. And then XML might be a sign of XXE, which is something, you know, do you want me to make a video on that? If there's demand, let me know. So yeah, don't just stop at, oh, information disclosure. I need to be thinking these bugs. Actually, there's quite a lot of other bugs out there. And this is my first Patreon shout out. This week's Patreon shout outs go to Guy and Val, I think that's correct, and Ram. If you want to be a shout out, get slides, early access to videos, private live streams, or access to my notes, consider joining my Patreon. And the link will be in the description. So thank you very much for watching this video. Thank you again to Integrity for sponsoring my content. I really don't take an advertiser lightly on my channel, and I actually do think they do really good things for the community, and it's seriously allowed me to make such major investments in my channel. A lot of people have been commenting about how the audio is a lot better, and people have liked when I've been on stream and had like fairy lights in the background. So actually being able to improve things like that has really let me make these kind of key investments in my channel and make better content. They always interact with the community, they're always replying to hackers and helping, so just give them a lot of love. You can sign up with my link on screen or in the video description. My link is go.integrity.com/Katie. It's in the description, it's on the screen. Please do consider signing up. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this useful. Maybe you're a little bit less afraid of JSON now, or XML, and I hope that maybe you can help find the information disclosure. The next video is going to be on mobile API hacking. I did say next 5 videos are all going to be on APIs and how to hack them. So I really hope you find all of that very useful, and I will see you all next time. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. Bye.